Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
Stories, science fiction stories about visitors coming down to Earth from other planets.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Chad Gross.
Hey.
I'm looking forward to this interview we've got lined up today, and it's with the great Frank Turek. And we last interviewed him in 2013. It's been a little while. Anyway, Dr. Frank Turek is a speaker and an author, or co-author of 4 books, Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case. Also, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Another one called Correct, Not Politically Correct, and one called Legislating Morality. So he's the president of crossexamined.org, presenting evidence for Christianity at churches, high schools, and at college campuses. So you can check out his show. It's a TV program each week called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, and we'll include all of those details in the show notes, as always. You can go to crossexamined.org for more. Now, we're going to ask Frank about his book, Hollywood Heroes, today, but also we've got a few secret questions up our sleeves.
Well, hey, Brian, I wanted to share with you a new resource that I think people will find very helpful in their quest for truth and in looking into philosophical, theological, and apologetics matters. I featured this on Truth Bomb this week on the August 23rd post, and it's called the Worldview Bulletin. And if you subscribe to the Worldview Bulletin, and you can find all the links there, and of course we'll put it in the show notes, you can grow your knowledge of the Christian worldview and your ability to defend it. There are world-class scholars sharing their expertise on there, including people like Paul Copan, who I know you've interviewed, Paul Gold, who we interviewed, Dr. Dave Baggett, who you know we love, Melissa Kane Travis, and of course, Christopher Reese. And you'll find original articles, interviews, guest contributions by world-class Christian scholars and apologists. There's news, announcements about new books, and special deals and discounts. And so I would encourage you to check out, again, that is the Worldview Bulletin. And we'll put the link there where you can go and subscribe. And of course, it's actually endorsed by Christian thinkers such as J.P. Moreland, Sean McDowell, Mike Licona, and John Lennox. So you can find some great stuff there. So check it out.
Great. The book we're going to be talking about today is called Hollywood Heroes, How Your Favorite Movies Reveal God. What were your thoughts on this, Chad? Because you know, you're the superhero guy, and a little bit of superhero stuff going on in there. So what did you think?
Well, you know, it's interesting, though. I thought about this earlier, Brian. When I was reading through the book, it was kind of neat because both of us are Lord of the Rings people. You're the Star Wars guy. I'm the superhero guy. And so it was a little bit of everything. It was like Brian and Chad combined into that book, you know, in that way. But I really enjoyed it. I think one of the things I would want listeners to know straight out of the gate is if they get a copy of the book, it's not, in a sense, a apologetics book. And even Frank has said that. Dr. Turek has said that in other interviews. It's a book that uses these heroes and some of the challenges that they face and says, what can we learn about our Christian walk? Or how does this inform us about culture? How does this inform us about what it means to live in this reality? What can we learn? And ultimately, what can these heroes teach us about God and the human predicament? And I really found it interesting. There were points that he brought out about a few of the films that I originally saw the films and I didn't even like the movie. For example, Batman versus Superman, Dawn of Justice. I just think there are some elements of that film that make it really, really difficult to watch and very silly. But he took a few of those points that I found silly and put a spin on them that I thought, you know, I bet you if I go back and watch that, it's going to have a little bit more meaning for me. I don't know that it's going to make me love the movie, but at least I'll be able to take something that applies to my Christian worldview a little bit. And so I think that listeners who really dig things like Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, the Marvel films, the Zack Snyder superhero films, things like that, I think you be encouraged in your faith. And of course, you'll be able to revisit some of your favorite scenes from those types of films. Well, Brian, I'm really hoping that Frank has watched the Obi-Wan series because I know that you are a tremendous fan of that show.
Yes.
And I just want to find out what Frank thought about Reva, who was one of the most stellar Star Wars characters who has been introduced to date. Just the coherence of the show. And yeah, I was hoping you could talk to Frank about that because I know that you're a big fan.
We won't be talking about that. That topic we'll save for the problem of evil in the world. So let's go to the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Frank, welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Great being on with you. It's been a while.
Yeah, I think it's been 2013 was the last time you were on, but thank you for your work, for what you continue to write in your books and the resources you're providing, podcasting and videos and whatnot. Now, you wrote Hollywood Heroes with your son, Zach. That's most of what we'll talk about today, but that had to be a great feeling to create something like that with your son.
Yeah, it was. He's actually a graduate of Southern Evangelical Seminary, too. Even though he's full-time in the Air Force, he got his master's degree in philosophy from there, and he knew movies so well that we decided, these movies so well, and there are so many parallels to the Christian worldview, believe it or not, in Hollywood's biggest blockbusters, that we said we should write a book about that. It took us a while to put it together, but finally we did. And it's called Hollywood Heroes, How Your Favorite Movies Reveal God. I know there's a lot of woke nonsense coming out of Hollywood right now, but the best movie franchises over the past, say, 4 or 5 decades don't have any of that in it.
Agreed. You agree?
Yeah, they're the ones that actually borrow from the greatest story ever told, the story of Jesus.
Yes. Yeah. And you would think when they do films that aren't woke, and they're so successful. I'm thinking of Spider-Man No Way Home or Top Gun Maverick. And they're huge and they're not woke at all. And they make tons of money. And the ones that are woke don't. But yet they just keep making them.
Thankfully, most of the movies that we review in Hollywood Heroes are the movies that came out, in previous decades. So they don't really have any of the woke nonsense in it. And they're the ones that are just mega hits. So we'll talk about those. They're great.
Well, before we start, I think that some Christians, they might sort of take the view, depending on how they were raised and whatnot, sort of environment they were in. Some Christians might take the view that, Hollywood, that's evil, or the people running Hollywood or clearly have a non-Christian agenda. There's wokeness. Therefore, they may take the stance of, rejecting everything that they put out. Or it could be something like this. This movie is about such and such a sin. It's like Harry Potter or witchcraft or something. So you cannot consume that content. So before we talk about all these movies, some of them contain that sort of thing. What are your ideas on that? And what's your view? And is it a black and white thing like that? And how do you think Christians should view things like that?
Well, first of all, not everything's age appropriate. We need to say that.
Yeah.
And secondly, I agree with parents because parents know their kids better than I do. If you think a kid watching, say, Harry Potter is going to suddenly get into the occult, then okay, don't have him watch Harry Potter. But thirdly, I think we need to realize that the Bible itself is rated R. Okay. And there's a lot recorded in the Bible that actually is negative because it's really what happened. It's a description of what happened, not a prescription of what we ought to do. Fourthly, I would say that the Apostle Paul, for example, called on the movies of his day, so to speak, when he's on Mars Hill. He starts quoting the prophets of the Greeks, right? He's quoting their own philosophers, their own prophets, if you will, in order to get a bridge to the gospel. And so he is taking the common ground that those people believe to try and get them to go to the gospel. And number 5, I would say, is the fact that Jesus used stories that weren't necessarily historical to teach moral or spiritual truths. You say, Frank, what are you talking about? Parables. If you were with Jesus, for example, and you said to Jesus, hey, he just say, for example, told the sermon on the, or told the Good Samaritan parable. If you said to Jesus, hey, Jesus, what was the Good Samaritan's name? He'd go, what are you talking about? Okay, this didn't really happen. This is just me making up a story to communicate a truth a spiritual, moral, or theological truth so you could understand it. I'm not saying these things really happened. And so many of the stories that we read about or we watch are just that. They're fictional stories, but many of them contain theological, moral, or philosophical truths, life lessons that we want to pass on to people. Yes, there's a lot of negative material in some of these movies, and we have to be aware of that. But there are also incredibly positive messages that we want to highlight to our kids.
Yeah.
One of the things that I thought was interesting about the book is you begin the book kind of telling the story of a real life hero and a Navy SEAL. And it kind of frames a lot of what comes after that. I was just wondering, what was your thinking in starting the book with that story, and how does that kind of lay a foundation for the rest of the book?
Yeah, the story is of Michael Monsoor, a story I tell a lot when I do a live talk. Michael Monsoor literally sacrificed himself to save his friends. He dove on a grenade because he had two of his Navy SEAL teammates lying in the sniper-prone position next to him. He could have saved himself by jumping through a doorway behind him, but if he had done that, his two teammates would have died. So he dove head first, face first, chest first onto the grenade. It detonated, and 30 minutes later, he died. But his colleagues, his teammates, only received minor injuries because Monsoor's body muffled the blast. And so I always ask people, that is the greatest form of love, isn't it? And of course, everyone agrees. And it's just quoting Jesus, who said, there's no greater love than to sacrifice yourself to save your friends. And I always ask them, Michael Monsoor died for his friends. Would anyone die for you? And the answer is someone already has. It's Jesus of Nazareth, right? Who went to the cross. Here's Michael Monsoor, a real world superhero. We're inspired by that story. Regardless of our religious beliefs, we could be atheists and say, now that's good, right?
Yes.
We could be atheists, everybody, because they all live in God's world, whatever they believe about God, they still think that sacrifice is a good thing. Well, it turns out that all of the movies that we cover here in Hollywood Heroes, all of these movies in some way involve sacrifice to save innocent people from evil. And that's exactly the story of Jesus. So that's why we started there.
Yeah, I thought that was a great way to frame the book. You've kind of touched on this a bit, but one of the points of the book is that Christians can use these popular movies and characters to share the gospel with unbelievers. However, this kind of harkens back to Brian's question about resistance to this a bit. I can easily imagine a fellow believer objecting to this and saying something like, all I need is to share the gospel. That's good enough. I don't need to use these stories. So how would you challenge them, and what advantages do these stories, or maybe what tools do these stories give us that help us maybe to communicate the gospel?
Well, I would go back to what I said previously about Paul and Jesus using either stories from their own culture or making up stories to communicate the gospel. I mean, why didn't Jesus show up and just say, here's the deal, I'm going to die for your sins and you trust in me. Thanks, that's all you need to know, I'm out. Right? He had so much more to teach. And sometimes people will not listen to you unless there's common ground. In fact, the parables are even framed that way, right? Jesus told parables so the people who were interested would get more interested in his message, and parables also kept people away from him who didn't want to know the truth. He actually hid the truth from people who wouldn't have wanted it. So Jesus and Paul used stories. They used the movies of their day to try and communicate this to other people. And I think what we say when we talk about the book Hollywood Heroes is we say, look, if you love Iron Man, you're going to love Jesus. If you love Harry Potter, you're going to love Jesus. If you love Wonder Woman or Batman or any of these characters, you're going to love Jesus. Why? Because all these characters sacrifice themselves in some way to save others, and that's what Jesus does for us. I mean, why are we enchanted with a movie, a story, where someone has to sacrifice to take innocent people and bring them to a place of bliss? They got to get them out of danger and take them to a place of bliss. Well, that's the very story of Christianity, that someone from outside this world comes to this world and saves us from ourselves and saves us from the impending danger and brings us to a place of bliss. So what I'm saying is that whether movie writers know this or not, some of them do, some of them don't, some of them are Christians, some of them are anti-Christians, they know what resonates with an audience. They know that a story like the gospel does resonate with audiences, and that's why, whether they know it or not, they put that kind of thing into their storyline.
Yeah. And I think that comes through very powerfully in the book. I'll tell you, one of the things that, and Brian, I know you have a follow up. I just wanted to say this before I forget. One of the things I was telling Brian before we started the podcast with you is that there were a few points you brought out into the book that actually made me like a few of the films better than I did when I initially saw them. For example, in Batman versus Superman, Dawn of Justice, when you brought out the point about, him being stabbed in the side with the kryptonite spear and kind of, paralleling that with Jesus. I had never connected that. So that was really cool. So listeners, that's a little taste of what you'll get here. And of course, you'll get more as we continue.
So, Frank, you're kind of telling us that there's these common cultural artifacts that, we can use. We can share themes of the ultimate story of Jesus, his rescue mission where he sacrifices himself. And I know you mentioned earlier how your son, Zach, he's the real movie buff. You work together with him on this. And so I'm thinking, I'm imagining that Frank's like, oh, I didn't even realize this, Zach, that this movie had this theme. What was there one or two maybe that surprised you the most that I didn't expect to see this in here? And
yeah, I would say, and this might bring some consternation to some of our Christian listeners who are against Harry Potter, but we argue in the book that Harry Potter arguably has more parallels to Jesus than any character in modern fiction. And people go, what? Harry Potter? The movie series and book series that many Christians boycotted? Yes. Now, before I get into the parallels, let me just point this out. A couple of things. I've noticed that Christians seem to have a problem with the occult in Harry Potter, but they have no problem with the occult in Lord of the Rings or Chronicles of Narnia.
Thank you.
My question is, well, why is that? I think one of the reasons is because C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien are trusted resources for Christians, whereas J.K. Rowling was unknown when she came out with the Harry Potter series. And so Christians, if C.S. Lewis had written the Harry Potter series, Christians would be fine with it, right? But they don't know who J.K. Rowling was. And J.K. Rowling has said that that the entire series, the Harry Potter series, can be epitomized by two Bible verses, both of which appear in the books and the movies. And that is, the last enemy to be destroyed is death, 1 Corinthians 15. And the other is, where your treasure is, your heart will be also. That's from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. She said, the entire series can be epitomized by those two verses. But I never wanted to let audiences know about that because I didn't want to tip them off as to where we were going. Where were they going? Here are four parallels of Harry Potter to Jesus. Number one, he is prophesied to be the savior of his world before he's born, and an evil force wants to kill him as an infant. Does that sound familiar? Secondly, he has to live a moral life in order to be the savior of his world. Thirdly, he sacrifices himself in order to beat the Satan figure Voldemort. And then fourthly, he rises from the dead, and his followers have to put their faith in him in order to finally defeat Voldemort. Does this sound familiar? This is the Christian story. It's just told in a different way. The kind of occult that you see in Harry Potter is not the kind of occult the Bible talks about. The Bible wouldn't consider, or we don't think anybody could really say, get on a broomstick and play a modified game of soccer in the air like they do in Harry Potter, right?
Right.
The kind of occult that you see in Harry Potter is made up out of J.K. Rowling's head. It's not the kind of stuff the Bible talks about, although there is one instance, I think in the last movie, they try and contact the dead and it doesn't go anywhere. But I've noticed, again, Christians don't have a problem with Gandalf, who's a wizard, but they do have a problem with Harry Potter. So my question is why?
Right.
There's so many parallels. And look, if you want to keep your kids away from Harry Potter, that's totally up to you. I support you 100%. But your kids ought to know the basic storyline of Harry Potter. Why? Because their non-Christian friends are watching it. And if you want to introduce your non-Christian friends to Jesus, it might be a segue you could make. Because if you like Harry Potter, you're going to love Jesus.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. It sounds to me like, sort of the implication of what you're showing here is not like, hey, these have a Christian theme, therefore enjoy, consume undiscriminately because there's this Christian theme you can draw. To me, it sounds more like, look, be discerning, recognize these themes, notice the worldviews, think worldviewishly, thinking Christianly about the things you're watching, acknowledge the good and the bad themes, watch out for the possible negative influences. But to me, it sounds like the biggest takeaway is talk about these things, think through these things, and, shield people that need shielding if needed. But these are tools. We need to be aware of what's going on in culture. Right? Would that be right?
Yeah, I think so. And in fact, at the end of every chapter, we have some questions that you can ask of your teenager or your young person after you watch the movie. I think sometimes we can communicate biblical lessons very effectively by saying, hey, let's have movie night. What kid isn't going to go, no, Dad, I don't want to do that. Oh, no, movie night. Are you kidding me? Just break out the Bible. Let's study Bible before. They're going to say, you got to do that too. But they're going to say, yeah, it'd be great. Let's do movie night. Why don't you invite your non-Christian friends over? We'll do movie night. We'll have popcorn. We'll read the chapter, and then we'll watch the movie, and then we'll discuss it.
I really like that because you're absolutely right. You can get kids engaged. I love the idea of having friends over to do that. Mm-hmm. And of course, as you said, not only are they going to get excited about movie night, but specifically if movie night has these types of movies that we're talking about, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I have to ask you about, I thought it was great that you begin the book kind of contrasting Captain America with Iron Man. We're kind of transitioning to Marvel now, away from Harry. And I know that am I correct that Tony Stark is your favorite, right?
For me, yeah.
Yes.
His favorite's probably Batman, but I really like the Iron Man character.
Yeah, that's what I thought. One of the points you make is that Tony is a lot more like us than, say, Steve Rogers. That's one of the points you guys make. Can you explain why you thought that was kind of an important point to make?
Sure, because you never have to worry what Steve Rogers, Captain America, is going to do because he's just good from the beginning, right? He doesn't really go on this character development arc. He's kind of Jesus already, right? But Tony Stark, he's got a lot of growing to do. I mean, he starts out as a amoral billionaire playboy arms dealer, right? And he's got everything you think you would want to be happy in America. What are the big three things that people think they want to be happy? They got to have sex, they got to have money, they got to have power. Tony Stark has it all, yet he's miserable. Why? Because he has no identity. He has no purpose. He doesn't really know what the purpose of life is. He's searching. He has everything to live with and nothing to live for. And then an incident occurs where one of his weapons he sold to terrorists blows up near him and puts shrapnel in his chest. And he has to have a device installed in the middle of his chest to guard his heart from encroaching shrapnel. Now, Chad, I don't know if the movie producers knew this, but this is a beautiful picture of what I think is the most important Bible verse in the Bible today, to today's culture, other than the gospel itself. And it comes from the Old Testament. It's Proverbs 4:23, which says, above all else, guard your heart because everything you do flows from it. Above all else, guard your heart. Our culture says, follow your heart. The truth is you need to guard your heart because if you follow your heart without moral restraint, you're going to wind up like Tony Stark. You're going to have everything to live with, nothing to live for. You're going to be miserable. But what Tony Stark learns to do over a series of movies, I mean, he starts out going, this guy will never be a hero. It's all about him, right? But then he goes to a series of sanctification, if you will. He's being sanctified over these several movies to the point at the end of Endgame, spoiler alert, Tony Stark sacrifices himself and dies defeating the Satan figure Thanos. Now, I don't know about you. I don't get all teary-eyed in movies, but I was almost teary-eyed when Tony Stark is dying. I'm going, my favorite character, and he just sacrificed himself, and he's going to be gone unless Doctor Strange comes in and does the multiverse thing again. But anyway, right? Now, everybody, I think, was enthralled and inspired by that ending. But could you imagine? And the movie producers knew that would be engaging and inspiring. But could you imagine if the movie producers went with the culture and gave a follow your heart message at the end? Imagine if Tony Stark, at the end of Endgame, as they're about to take on Thanos, he turns to his Avenger buddies and he goes, guys, I'm just not feeling it today. I don't want to take on Thanos. I got to get back to following my heart and taking care of just me. I'm out. And then the movie ends. Would anybody go, wow, that was inspiring? He followed his heart. He turned tail and ran. No, everyone would go, that's awful.
Yeah.
And so, despite the fact that culture's saying follow your heart, what really inspires us is not people who follow their heart, but follow the truth and do what's right, even when it costs them.
Well put. Frank, one of the things you mentioned there that I wanted to ask you about is kind of that people that desire sex, money, and power. You mentioned guarding your heart. And one of the things Brian and I have talked about numerous times on the podcast, and you having such you're a very popular Christian apologist. You have quite a platform through Cross-Examined and your debates and things like that. One of the ways that I've heard you talk about, I think, and J. Warner Wallace, I know for sure, is how one of the ways that desire for power can manifest itself even in the heart of a Christian is through desiring popularity on social media.
That's right.
Yeah. So how do you, as somebody who's in the public eye, who is a very popular apologist, very well known, how do you guard your own heart against that? And what would be your word to other Christians that are also on social media, how they can balance that?
Yeah, I know it's a good question. And for me, I know it's going to sound weird. I've never put a YouTube video up. I don't even know how to do it. Okay. So
that's one way.
We're a great team that does all that. I don't do any of that. I don't select any of that. It just, they put it up. So we have a great team that does all that. And, I'd be lying if I didn't say we didn't look at it and see how we're doing. We want to make sure that we're being successful in what we're doing, but we don't try and get our worth from that. And I'm reminded of something that the Billy Graham organization decided to do way back in the 1940s. Have you guys ever heard of the Modesto Manifesto?
I have not.
Modesto Manifesto is something that the Billy Graham organization put in place in Modesto, California in the late 1940s. You can Google this and find out what it's about. But the bottom line is they decided that they were trying to shield themselves from the big three temptations: sex, money, and power. So, for example, with regard to money, they said, when we do our crusades, we're never handling the money. Somebody else is going to do that. Secondly, when we have a crusade, we're never going to inflate our numbers. We're never going to try and estimate the crowd. Whatever the police say we're in the auditorium or at the stadium, that's the estimate we're going to go with. We're never going to try and tell people that our crusades were bigger than they really were. And thirdly, when it comes to the sex issue, we've all decided we are never going to be in the presence of another woman who's not our wife alone, ever, unless it's a relative or something. You get the idea.
Sure.
Because we don't want to be put in that particular temptation. Now, Billy Graham organization has been around for probably 70 or 80 years. Have you ever heard of a scandal coming out of it? No. Why? Because they adhere to the Modesto Manifesto, and we try and do the same thing. We have to shield ourselves from ourselves. Nobody ever broached the Great Wall of China. The only way people got through is when somebody let them through. In other words, there was an internal integrity issue. Well, the same thing is true with us. What happened to Ravi Zacharias? Internal integrity issue. He didn't have the accountability, or he didn't adhere to the Modesto Manifesto. And Robbie did a lot of great stuff, said a lot of great things, but in the end, he didn't finish well. And look, we're all vulnerable. Any of us could fall. Right. So we have to make sure that we do that. We have to make sure that we adhere to the Modesto Manifesto to the best of our ability. And we also have to point out that, look, really God is in control of all this. We just do what's right, leave the results to God.
Yeah. And I one of the big things I heard you say there, not the only thing, but one of the big things I heard you say there is that accountability is a big piece.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Like, it sounds to me like even if you were tempted by those things, it would be hard for you to get away with them because you have this team and you're keeping each other accountable and stuff. Good. Thank you. That was helpful.
Yeah, I have more like off-topic questions about the book and whatnot, which I'm going to keep in my back pocket at the moment. But, this kind of relates to, keeping your heart right, because I want to find out where your heart is, Frank, when it comes to Star Wars versus superhero movies. Do you have a preference? What do you like?
Well, for me, look, I grew up with the first three movies. When the first movie came out, I was 15. So the New Hope movie, which is, say is number 4, it's really number 1. I don't know. Go backwards, right? Okay.
Yes.
So those movies were great. I'm not a big aficionado of the other movies, but Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, that's Star Wars to me. I love those movies.
Yeah.
I love those movies, and we point out so many parallels to Christianity, and then we also point out where they differ from Christianity.
Yeah.
Right. Of course, in Star Wars, it's fideism. It's just have faith. Don't look at evidence. Where in Christianity, it's the exact opposite. Look at evidence and then trust in your Savior. So we point all that out. We point out the redemption of Darth Vader. We point out how Anakin fell into sin. It's the same way that we fall into sin. We're tempted by our own desires, what we were just talking about. We don't have accountability. We fall into it, and we're enticed and dragged away, to use phraseology that James uses in his little book in the New Testament. That's exactly what happened to Anakin. So we point all that out. We also point out the redemption of Han Solo, which is a lot of fun, because Han Solo is the skeptic on the good side of the Force. And he goes from somebody who is like, kid, this is all nonsense. This is mumbo jumbo. You got to have a good blaster at your side. And then, of course, he has all the best lines. Look, your worshipfulness, I'm in this for just me, right?
Yes.
He's got all the best lines. So we have a lot of fun with that in the book Hollywood Heroes. I really love those first 3 Star Wars movies. But I also love, the Iron Man series. I like Iron Man more than the others. But if you had to pick one series, I think... Here are the series we go through. Your Captain America, Iron Man, Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, Batman, Wonder Woman. We have some Superman in there. We mentioned Spider-Man a few times. Out of all those, I'd probably say Star Wars would be my favorite, followed closely by Iron Man. Just because, it's been around so long.
That's enough. We got what we needed. So
no, you got what you needed.
No, Chad and I have this fight. Like I like Star Wars better than the superhero movies. So now that we've heard from the authority, we can move on. Now,
Chad, I find your lack of faith.
Hey, that reminds me. I didn't plan on bringing this up, but since you just did that. If I'm correct, you recorded an audio version of this book and you do voices. Am I right?
Yeah, not good ones, though. I really can't. I can do like Smeagol or my precious, who can't do that? Everybody can do that. But yeah, I don't have the James Earl Jones thing. I tried it. When you listen to it, you'll hear me go, I find your lack of faith disturbing. But it's not really good, We did the Babylon Bee podcast. Jared over there, who plays Satan in the Babylon Bee, movies. He was doing "I find your lack of faith disturbing" with like a British accent, and we just couldn't stop laughing at it.
Yeah, classic.
Disturbing. It's like a or something.
Yeah, it like really takes away the oomph, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that the Revenge of the Sith has to be one of the best Star Wars movies as far as like. Just so dramatic in how Anakin turns to the dark side and he's sort of possessed and controlled and just overtaken. And it's just, but at the same time, you could see it coming just because of all the selfish desire all leading up to it. And it was almost just like the pinnacle of it. So in the book, you point out how this is just like a perfect picture of sin and how, your heart can be sort of captured and things like that.
You know what George Lucas said about that, too? That scene where Anakin gives in to the Sith leader who becomes the Emperor.
Yeah.
He said that's the moment that Anakin succumbed to the devil. That's what he said. Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's using some Christian, even though he's not a Christian, George Lucas, he's using some Christian storyline in there it's a morality play, he says. Of course, it's good versus evil, And, that's where he succumbed to the devil. The Sith that's the guy he's supposed to kill, not give into, right?
Yeah. Well, you had a really great discussion on Unbelievable with the skeptic Pelogia. It was centered around mainly the Star Wars because he worked on the prequels with George Lucas.
He did that when he was a Christian. He was working for Lucas.
Yeah. And one of the things you discuss in your dialogue, and by the way, listeners, I recommend you look that up if you haven't heard it yet, was how the Force and the God of the Bible are similar and how they're different. Can you unpack that a little bit? And how might believers use the Force in a conversation with, say, an unbelieving Star Wars fan to kind of maybe lead into the gospel?
Yeah, well, the Force in Star Wars is impersonal. So there's no ought to the Force. It just turns out that things work out better for you if you follow the light side rather than the dark side. And isn't it interesting that the characters that follow the dark side have that darkness revealed in their physical appearance. So Emperor Palpatine is all wrinkled up. His eyes are bloodshot. He's all droopy. Darth Vader is mostly a breathing machine. I don't know who says it, whether it's 3PO or somebody in there says he's more machine than man.
Yes.
Alec Guinness who said that, something like that. It's expressed physically, whereas people on the light side, like Luke and Leia, they're pristine. Nothing wrong with them. And this also happens in real life. If you abuse yourself long enough, if you stay in sin long enough, it's going to be expressed in your physical appearance, even though it doesn't happen as quickly as it does in Star Wars. But with regard to the Force, as I say, it's impersonal. And it seems to work better if you stay on the light side than the dark side. Now, when it comes to the Holy Spirit is personal, so it can give you an ought. It's not an impersonal force like Star Wars. It's a personal force. And there are some things that you can only experience from the inside. Like, for example, in Star Wars, you can only really experience the Force if you trust in it, if you believe in it, right? Well, the same thing is true in Christianity. There's only some things you're going to get the Holy Spirit to do if you trust in him, if you believe in him. There's some things that only make sense when you're on the inside of the worldview, not when you're standing back from the worldview being a skeptic. So those are some of the things I think you can point out some parallels and some differences.
Good.
I'm going to veer off and ask some of these bonus questions because, I want to catch up and ask you a few things. Back in 2013, I asked you, advice for apologists. And, things have changed in the landscape of apologetics since then, the different challenges we face with maybe more cultural things. There's less, maybe atheism isn't the number one thing that people are addressing right now. And at the same time, there's more resources at people's fingertips. There's a lot more access to videos and books and apologetics curriculum, that sort of thing. So I guess I'll re-ask the sort of question I would have asked back then, and that's what advice would you give to someone studying apologetics, seeing that the sort of cultural things we're dealing with today?
Yeah, well, I would say a couple of things. I may have said this in 2013 too, that apologists ought to major in the majors and not the minors. Don't build your ministry around secondary or tertiary issues. Build your ministry around the essentials. Now, for me, when it comes to the pointing out that Christianity is true, as you know, when we go to a college campus or even a church, I'm at a church here in Florida right now as we record this, I just cover 4 questions. Does truth exist? Does God exist? Are miracles possible? And is the New Testament reliable enough to let us know if Jesus rose from the dead? Because if Jesus rose from the dead, game over, Christianity's true. Okay, so we go through those 4 questions. Of course, when we're dealing with truth, we're dealing with all the self-defeating statements that the culture makes. You have your truth, I have my truth, all truth is relative, right? All those kind of statements. So we hit on the cultural issues then. So when you're just trying to show that Christianity is true, I'd say stay on those 4 issues. You want to talk about the age of the earth? You can, but it's not the center of Christianity, right? You want to talk about eschatology? You can, but it's not the center of Christianity. Christians can have different views on that. You want to talk about the difference between Calvinism and Molinism or Arminianism? You can, but it shouldn't be the center of your ministry unless you're just trying to do a ministry in that regard, right? Sure. I think we really have to be involved in showing that Christianity is true. Now, secondly, to these cultural issues, I think we need to address them as well. I was just at a conference out in California with my friend Charlie Kirk, who is an organization called TPUSA, and he did a pastors conference. And one of the pastors got up there and said this: we need to address the issues of the culture because our congregants want to know they're not going insane. What does that mean? Like, for example, on the transgender issues, people are starting to doubt there are 2 genders, right? Are you kidding me? And why? Because the church isn't addressing them. The churches, they have their head in the sand. Meanwhile, our kids are being talked into transgenderism. There's been a 6,000% increase in the past few years, at least the past decade, of young girls claiming to be trans. 6,000%. What do you think? Is there something new in the water? Is there something new in biology? No. You know what's new? Social media. It's a social contagion. Yes. And we are not addressing it. Yeah. And what we ought to be saying is, look, do you realize that transgenderism presupposes fixed genders? Because if I'm a man and I think I'm a woman, I have to have some idea what a man is and some idea what a woman is to know the difference. And I have to have some idea what a man is and some idea what a woman is to make the so-called transition, even though it's biologically impossible to do. But I have to know something about men and women to know the difference. If men and women don't exist, transgenderism would be meaningless. In fact, there's a little bit of a cultural war, I should say a civil war inside the LGBTQ community. And it's this: if the T's get their way, that there are no fixed genders, then the L, the G, and the B don't exist. Because if there are no genders, you can't be lesbian, you can't be gay, you can't be bisexual if there are no genders. And by the way, the feminists aren't happy with this either. Because if there are no genders, there are no women. And if there are no women, there are no women's rights. This is why J.K. Rowling, who is the author of the Harry Potter series, has stood her ground against the transgender movement, because she said, you are erasing women by saying that there are 100 different genders or whatever.
Yeah.
There are no such thing as women if there are no genders. So she's standing strong, despite the fact that even some of the people that acted in her movies are trying to cancel her.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, they're saying they wouldn't appear if they did some kind of reunion movie or something, if she had something to do with it or whatnot.
And here are these people saying that, and that yet they have no standard by which to say anything's right or wrong. For example, Daniel Radcliffe, the kid who played Harry Potter, I think claims to be an atheist. And yet he is somehow morally outraged at his own author, J.K. Rowling, when in fact he has no standard by which to judge anything's right or wrong if he's an atheist. This is just his own personal opinion. And somehow he's morally outraged that J.K. Rowling, who claims to be an Anglican Christian, is standing strong on a principle that everyone knows deep in their hearts is true. There are men, there are women. That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, great. I think that's good advice. Just a follow-up question. And this is a little more personal question, but, you've been doing this for a long time. And I always think of you, Frank, as someone who's very positive and animated. And then I think, does he ever get discouraged, And so I wanted to ask you, is there anything that ever gets you discouraged when it comes to defending the faith that makes me, maybe gives you a feeling of disheartenedness, discouraged? And how have you dealt with that?
Well, what discourages me a little bit is how uninterested people are in truth, right? It's all feelings oriented. In fact, my friend Natasha Crane just wrote a book called Faithfully Different, in which she points out the 4 basic tenets of the secular mind. Number 1 is that feelings are the ultimate guide. Number 2, happiness is the ultimate goal. Number 3, therefore, judging is the ultimate sin. And number 4, God is the ultimate guest. Because, you might believe in God, but nobody really knows if God exists. And if he makes you feel better, that's fine, but don't impose anything you think he's told you on us, right? Because look, feelings are my guide, happiness is my goal, judging is the ultimate sin. And if that is indeed the case, this is why we have people claiming that, for example, they're a different gender than what they really are, because their feelings tell them that and they want to be happy. And anybody who tells them they can't do that is somehow interfering with their happiness. And that's the ultimate sin. You can't do that.
When you encounter that, is that sort of the same sort of things like apatheism, like where people don't care? And so it's like, well, how do I even talk to this person? How would you address that?
Yeah, there is apatheism. The way I address it is I always ask people, if I'm having a conversation with them, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? Mm-hmm. I ask that on college campuses all the time. And a lot of times the atheists or the non-believers will say no. And I'll say, no, how is it reasonable that you wouldn't believe something if it were true? Well, it's not reasonable. It's not a head problem. It's a heart problem. They don't want there to be a God because they want to be God of their own lives. They're not on a truth quest. They're on a happiness quest. And they're just going to believe whatever they think is going to make them happy. And the problem is you can make yourself happy over the short term doing a lot of fun things, but over the long term, it's a disaster. And anyone listening to this right now who's over 40 knows what we're talking about, because many of us have tried it ourselves, right?
Yes.
Well, we're going to do it our own way and be happy. No, you're not. You're going to be Tony Stark. You're going to get all the money, you're going to get all the power, you're going to get all the sex you want, and you're still going to be miserable because you're not following the truth.
Yeah. It's interesting talking about those cultural issues. For example, the transgender issue, and I think even homosexuality, and the church is kind of slowly eroding view in some sense, in some cases when it comes to that, which I know you've written a book on this. One of the points, kind of transitioning back to the book just because it fits really well, is you make about Batman versus Superman, is that Batman has become hardened and kind of even cruel because of all this evil and suffering he's experienced. And I can kind of see a parallel here, because believers, I think when we see society, it does seem like in a lot of senses it's eroding. Much of what the Bible maybe teaches is getting scoffed at or whatnot. how can we talked a bit about what discourages you personally? How can believers keep from getting hardened or becoming callous like Batman?
Yeah, I think one of the things we can do is to point out when evil persists in a society, that's just another piece of evidence that Christianity is true, right? That we are fallen, and God said things would go poorly, and that people would call evil good and good evil. Look, if Christianity wasn't true, perhaps we wouldn't know right from wrong. We wouldn't know evil. Of course, Christianity wasn't true; nothing would exist. But the main point here is that Christianity predicts that we're evil. Christianity tells us we're evil. In fact, it's the only real worldview that gets it right. All the other worldviews think people are inherently good, whereas Christianity makes the case that people are inherently evil. We're bent toward evil. It's easy to be bad. It's hard to be good. It's easy to be selfish. It's hard to be selfless. You know, I don't have to tell a 2-year-old mine. He's already knows that word. I got to tell him to share, right?
Right.
Because we are just bent toward evil. So when things really go badly, I go, you know what? This is just more evidence that Christianity is true. In fact, when it was discovered that Ravi had done some immoral things, I said, look, this is just more evidence Christianity is true. Because if Christianity wasn't true, if there was no God, what Ravi did wouldn't be wrong. Yet everybody knows it's wrong.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
So, and in fact, I like what John Dixon said. You guys know who John Dixon is?
Yeah.
He is a historian from down under, wrote the book Bullies and Saints, great book on church history. And he says this. He says, if somebody plays Bach poorly, who do you blame? You don't blame Bach, right?
Right.
You don't blame Bach. Well, if somebody plays Jesus poorly, who do you blame? You don't blame Jesus either, right?
Right.
In fact, we're fallen creatures. And since we are fallen, you ought to expect Christians to be fallen. You ought to expect Christians to be poor players of Jesus. But newsflash, Christianity is not Christians. Christianity is Jesus. So just because we as believers aren't true and beautiful doesn't mean Jesus isn't true and beautiful. So when Christians do evil things, you might go, you know, Jesus predicted that. Right?
Wow.
We would do. And if we were perfect, we wouldn't need a savior. So
Yeah,
I think we have to point out to people that whenever evil occurs, whenever they claim there's something wrong with the world, they're actually giving evidence for God.
Wow. Those things just affirm the gospel and our need for Christ. Yeah. That's good. That's good. So I have a question I've wanted to ask you for I don't know how long. It's a fun one. You wrote a very influential apologetics book with Norm Geisler. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. I know he's since passed. I did have an opportunity to meet him, and what an amazing, amazing guy. And but since you guys wrote that book, there's been so much more evidence that has come out, right, for the Christian faith. So I've brought this up to Brian a few times. Have you ever thought about writing kind of an updated version and calling it I Still Don't Have Enough Faith?
Well, that's actually the name of our online course. I still don't have enough faith to be an atheist.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
We have online courses at crossexamine.org. In fact, I'm about to start teaching one September 26th, I think, where I'm the instructor, and we have some video and then some live Zoom Q&A sessions. So, yeah. In fact, we may update it. We probably myself and I might ask someone in the Geisler family to, at least review it just to be clear.
Oh, that would be neat.
Yeah, and we may do it at the 20-year mark, which is in 2024.
Oh, okay.
But to be honest with you, Chad, there's evidence. There's more evidence we could put in the book that has been discovered since then, but it doesn't change really the fundamental structure of the book. It's pretty evergreen. It's still, there's evidence that truth exists. There's evidence that God exists. There's a few things that's been discovered since then, but it's not revolutionary. It's not like we have to update it. Just like, okay, there would be a few, say, discoveries in astronomy that further make the case that there was a beginning. There's a few new arguments with regard to the biblical evidence that the New Testament's telling the truth. I think of, say, Richard Baucham's work on Jesus and the eyewitnesses. That's all computer stuff. Gary Habermas is about to release his magnum opus, at least the first volume of his resurrection. I mean, there's new ways of saying things. But even if we update it, it's probably not going to be a new book. It's just going to be an updated version of the old one.
Yeah. And I do really like that 4-question outline you use. I was in a conversation with a friend of mine for a long period of time, and he kept sending me these emails about random questions about Old Testament obscure Old Testament passages and things like that. And it was so helpful I met him for coffee and I wrote down the 4 questions and I said, look, do you agree if we could say yes to all 4 of these questions that Christianity's true? He said, yes. I said, okay, well, let's just focus on these 4 questions. And so whenever he would send me something, I would say, well, let's bring that back to the 4 questions. And it really allowed us to like stay kind of on the main thing, like you were saying. So
Frank, it's been an excellent conversation, and we want to point people to your book, Hollywood Heroes. What other sort of resources you want to point people to while you have an opportunity here? And we'll also link in the show notes.
Sure. I do want to say this. In the book, Hollywood Heroes, How Your Favorite Movies Reveal God, the last chapter is about the ultimate hero, Jesus of Nazareth, and how all the heroes that we go through point to the ultimate hero, but don't quite make the same have the same qualities that Jesus has. They have little pieces, but not the entire package, as you might imagine. And as I say, there are questions out there that parents and youth group leaders or pastors can use with their congregation. So I hope people will use it in that regard. With regard to other resources, if they go to crossexamine.org, there's a wealth of information up there. That's kind of our brain center. We've got a lot of YouTube videos on our YouTube channel, and we're on Instagram. We're on now TikTok. And if they don't do anything else, download the Cross-Examined app. 2 words in the App Store, Cross-Examined. It has our podcast, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, there, which is only 48 minutes every week. Got our TV show streaming live off it, 9 p.m. Eastern time on Wednesdays. It's got a quick answer section. So if people go there, and then all the online courses, it's not just me teaching online courses. We have Jay Warner Wallace, Gary Habermas, Dan Wallace, Elisa Childers, Sean McDowell, Scott Klusendorf. We're about to get one here soon from Steve Meyer. So we're really trying to have a broad base of online courses. And the beauty of these courses is if they take the premium version of them, they're not only going to get all the content, but they're going to be able to, via Zoom, ask questions live of the instructor on several occasions. So people can really ask what they want to ask of the people that wrote the books. So that's what we're doing.
excellent.
Great. Well, again, I will point people to those things. Check the show notes for those links. Frank Turek, it's been a real pleasure. Crossexamine.org. Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Brian and Chad. Thanks for reading the book, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.